Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the second week of the Happiness Trap podcast. My name is Cassie.
And my name is Leah. Welcome back, everyone.
And this week we will be reviewing chapters 4 through 14 of the Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. And the first thing that we get into in these chapters is the concept of diffusion. So, Leah, what do you think about diffusion?
So I think the most important thing to understand about diffusion is that it is not a control strategy. And we talked about control strategies last week. So we're not trying to get rid of those unpleasant thoughts, but rather to see them for what they are. And that's what Dr. Harris talks about on page 54. He says, the aim of diffusion is not to get rid of unpleasant thoughts, but rather to see them for what they are, just words, and to let go of struggling with them. And that seems to me to be the thing that people get wrong about diffusion all the time, right? They think, oh, great, this is just going to be a thing that makes me feel better. That's not the point of diffusion at all, right? It's to allow space for them.
Right. And I love this because we are learning just how to be with our thoughts. And our thoughts are a part of ourselves. So, really, we're learning how to be with ourselves when we're learning how to do this without trying to struggle with trying to get rid of everything, with trying to control everything. We're really just looking at how can we just be?
Yeah, when I first heard the idea of diffusion, it felt really peaceful to me,
Mhm.
right? That, like, oh, my thoughts actually aren't really doing anything, right? It's my behaviors that do things.
Yep.
But my thoughts, right, they're just hanging out, doing whatever. And getting used to that, it feels like peace to me.
Yeah, it does. I'll quote Dr. Harris here because I loved this. I highlighted it. I started when I was reading it. On page 53, he says, diffusion is aimed at freeing ourselves from the oppression of our thoughts. And that hit me really hard because our thoughts can feel really oppressive at times. They can feel really heavy and just really real. And the idea that diffusion is this tool, this strategy that we can use to free ourselves from that oppression and become lighter and become more invested in our life and being able to invest in those meaningful activities then that he continuously talks about through the book so we can live a rich, full, and meaningful life.
Yeah, I started that when I was reading it too. It felt really important to me too. And I think that it is important to talk about, like, okay, yes, if we're not consumed with these thoughts, then we do actually have time and energy and room to pursue more meaningful activities. And I think that, especially for me, anxiety thoughts can be so exhausting,
Mhm.
right? That there is actually not any energy left for anything else, even things that I love, right? And so the idea of being free from that zap of energy feels really exciting.
Yeah, I love that too. And I think as we're talking about these diffusion strategies, I experienced it when I first got introduced to diffusion. It sounds like a lot to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
It can sound like a lot just in general. And I think he talks about it's okay to feel like that. Notice that you're having that thought and just move on and do it anyway. And kind of the aim here is the more that we practice this, the more it'll become an instant skill. The more that we're training our
Mm-hmm.
brain to just do it as those thoughts pop up automatically to the point where we might not even think about it. And so I kind of want to put that out there because we are going to be talking about some of these strategies and it's going to be like, wow, well, that might take some time or that might take some practice to do. And that's the point of this, to just keep practicing it until it becomes more natural for us.
Yeah, I think that perfectionism can really be an enemy when trying to learn diffusion because you want to do it in the exact right way, in the
Hmm.
exact perfect way. Well, the reality of the situation is that your particular strategy that works best for you might not be the same as anyone else's. It might look different than everyone else's, and it might take a little bit of time to learn, right? So if you're going to be so rigid about getting it exactly right, you're going to get frustrated and then stop. And that's the opposite of what we're trying to do, right?
Exactly.
It's to get frustrated and keep going.
Yes, yes. Keep going. That's what we're going to do. So, Leah, what is your favorite diffusion strategy?
So, my favorite diffusion strategy is naming your stories. Dr. Harris talks about that on page 44. So just kind of naming it as the story I tell myself is, this, right? Like the story I'm telling myself is that I'm going to fail at this. I think partially I love this one because in undergrad I was an English major, so I love stories. Stories are really important to me, but they also are just words, right? So I loved that. Here comes I'm going to fail at this story. And that helps me detach myself from it, right? It's not the roller coaster I'm riding. I'm just watching it play out in front of me, and that helps. Cassie, what about you? What's your favorite?
Yeah, I love the silly voices technique. I think this is a great way for us to take ourselves a little less seriously. So he talks about silly voices on page 51 in his True Blues chapter. And essentially, what we're doing is we're not trying to push away the thought, we're not trying to fight with it. We're just recognizing that we have a little bit of control to manipulate the thought. And so instead of that authoritarian voice that typically goes through your mind that kind of makes it sound like you shouldn't question your thoughts, you realize that you can change the way that they sound in your mind and put them to a voice that might make you laugh. Some suggestions that I've heard kind of in my work, people do SpongeBob SquarePants. He has a very distinct, funny voice. Peter from Family Guy, that could be another funny one. But just, and when people do it, they say, I feel silly doing this. And I say that's the point, we can recognize that we can also laugh at these thoughts, right? They don't just have to bring the doom and gloom that they sometimes bring, but we can kind of be a little more airy with them. I always like to give the metaphor. This is going to be a Harry Potter metaphor, so some people might not follow along. Leah, I know you will. But
yes, desperately, I'll follow along.
So in the third book movie, there's kind of this creature that turns into the thing that you fear the most. It's called a boggart, and it's kept in a closet. When it comes out of the closet, it turns into your worst fear. And the spell that you cast on it then is called ridiculous, and it's a play on the word ridiculous, and it makes that image turn into something that you laugh at. And the only thing that takes away the power of that creature then is laughing at it. And once everyone starts laughing at it, it goes back away and it goes back into its hole because it realizes it doesn't have any power there. And that's really how I see some of these diffusion techniques. And how can we take power away by giving a different emotional response than that thought was trying to get out of us?
Yeah, one of my favorite things about your approach to ACT, Cassie, is how much you incorporate silliness in it. And I think it's absolutely a part of ACT. And I just love it, right? Because I think we have to learn to not take ourselves so seriously sometimes. And the practice of learning that not all of our thoughts are true thoughts is exactly the process of not taking ourselves too seriously.
Yes, it really is. Because if we take ourselves too seriously, then we don't have time to laugh or to kind of have fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So after diffusion, he talks a little bit about this distinction between our thinking self and our observing self. Um, did you have any thoughts about the distinction that he made between those two?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I think he points out that in our Western culture, we don't talk about the observing self very much. And there's a massive emphasis on the thinking self. And so we know all about the thinking self. That's what we've just been talking about, right? But the observing self is an important component to ACT because it's actually the way in which we are able to do diffusion and expansion, which we'll talk about later. And so it's, for me, my understanding of it was the observing self is the thing everyone has. Everyone has it, and it's with us always. So as our thinking self evolves and changes, our observing self is always present to just like to observe what's going on. What's your take on it, Cassie?
Yeah, I really love that he makes this distinction, and he does talk about how this is a newer concept to Western culture. Um, and the idea that this observing self is aware, but it doesn't think. It's the part of you that's responsible for focus, attention, and awareness. So some of these more abstract concepts that we don't always think about, especially when we think about how our thoughts are causing different emotional reactions and we really want to try to control them and get rid of them. we really need to pay attention to what piece of us is that thinking self and what piece of us is that observing self. And kind of throughout our life, our thinking self changes a lot, right? The way that we think about things right now probably isn't the way that we thought about things 5 years ago or 10 years ago or when we were children. And so the thinking self kind of continually changes as we change and grow. But this observing self is consistent throughout our life. This self that's kind of in us that pays attention to what's happening, that notices what's going on with us, is the same self that's been there when we were young and we were learning how to potty train. It was the same one that was in there when we were going through that awkward teenage phase when we were maybe going into high school. And it's that same one that's with us now. And for me, there's some sort of serenity in that, knowing that, there are a lot of pieces of me that change, but there's also this kind of consistent self too.
Yeah, the observing self was with me through every bad haircut, through my pre-straightened teeth days, right? It was there for all of that. I think one of the really crucial things to me about the thinking and the observing self is on page 66, where Dr. Harris says, with all of these diffusion skills, this is what we're aiming for. If the thinking self is broadcasting something unhelpful, the observing self does not have to pay attention to it. But if the thinking self is broadcasting something useful or helpful, the observing self can tune in and pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so, just kind of using this ability that we have to observe to help us live a more meaningful existence.
Right. I love that too. So this idea that, this thinking self versus observing self, our observing self can choose what it pays attention to then. Our thinking self can do whatever it wants to do in the background, and our observant self can choose to pay attention to it or not. And I think he gives the example somewhere, I'm not quite sure where, of having a radio in the background while you're working on something. And if you're really into what you're working on and you kind of get a flow going, then you kind of tune out the radio. You don't really pay attention to it. But if you're in that thinking space of, wow, this radio is really annoying and I don't have any way to turn it off, then it's going to sound a lot louder and it's going to take your attention away from your task a lot more often. And so with these different strategies that we're learning about, this diffusion, we'll talk about some mindfulness strategies. We're just learning how to shift that observing self to different tasks and different thoughts that kind of help us create that meaning in our life and make sure that we're doing the things that are important to us.
Yeah, you know what is, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking that all of this stuff is actually calling us to slow down a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we can't observe if we're hustling and bustling so much that we're not tuned into that. And so this call to slow down a little and to notice these things, I think is also really important. Because you can miss the observing self
Mm-hmm.
if you're just flying by, right?
Yep, exactly. And he gives us a good strategy to do that then in our daily life, something that we can do wherever we are, whatever we're doing, to take the 10 deep breaths. And by doing so, that can kind of recenter us and refocus us, and kind of help free up some of that space within us too.
It's so easy, right? Like
Yeah.
literally just breathe. What
Mm-hmm.
you're already doing, just do that. And then it's kind of crazy to me that is the thing that will recenter and ground us,
Mm-hmm.
to just breathe. But I also love that it's so simple, right? It's something that we can all do. We can all ground back to this
Right.
moment.
Exactly. And he says then after that he introduces the 10 breath strategy, he reminds us again that we're not trying to avoid or get rid of these unwanted thoughts, but we're simply allowing them to be there, to come and go as they please. And that's something that he keeps coming back to again and again throughout the chapters. And that's such an important piece of this. We're just allowing things to be. We're choosing not to struggle with the things that come up.
Yeah, I have been thinking a lot about um, this idea of struggling,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that seems to be so crucial to act in general, right? Like this idea that a lot of our issues come from struggling with our emotions. and that it is actually just so countercultural to stop striving and to just let them be. So I think, if anyone's like reacting to this and saying like, oh, this sounds like very bizarre. That was my reaction too, right? Like, what do you mean if I stop struggling, if I stop working on this, right? That it might help me. But to just buy into it a little bit more fully was helpful for me.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with everything you just said. So he then kind of shifts a little bit, and he kind of goes back to diffusion, but in a different way. So the first diffusion strategies we were talking about were thought strategies, right? But he acknowledges that sometimes our thoughts present to us in the form of pictures or images. And so he gave a couple different strategies for diffusing if your thought comes up as a picture or an image. What did you think about that?
I thought that was really interesting, because I think it does address how different people think. My thoughts normally come in the form of words, right? So I was like, oh, this is foreign to my experience. This isn't how I normally move about the world. But the subtitles one felt really good to me, and it's probably because it also goes along with the story piece. I don't know. Do you think mostly in words, or do you think in images?
See, I usually, like when I'm kind of on autopilot, I think in words, but when I was reflecting on this for myself in my own mindful practice, I create an image when I'm practicing my mindfulness of kind of a scene in a place where I am. So I notice that when I'm more intentional about my thoughts, they seem to be more images and pictures for me. But I think that just speaks to the differences in each individual's experience with how things come up in our minds.
Right. It felt like a huge blind spot to me as I was coming across this. I was like, oh, I hadn't even considered that people would think in images, right? Because I didn't think in that way, right?
Right.
And so I love that this got addressed. So yeah, I think it would be really, really interesting. I don't know if I can learn to think in images. Maybe I'll try that out and see if I can do some guided meditation to do some imagery. But yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea of for people who do think of in images, to putting it on a television screen and kind of seeing it in that context. Because again, it's that idea of it doesn't seem as real then, right? If it's something you're watching on TV.
It's a story, it's separate from you, right? All of these strategies are trying to help us separate our true selves from these stories, pictures, thoughts, whatever it is, right? It's trying to give us some distance between them so we don't get hooked together on them, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, I think the TV strategy is a great one. Incorporating the story I'm telling myself, all of that stuff is helpful to get some space between that.
Yeah, definitely.
It feels less scary then.
It does. You're right. So I think overall, I really love all of the diffusion strategies that he's presented in this book. I think they give people a lot of different options because he talks about, one might work in one situation and not another situation. Or maybe there's a strategy that just never works for you because it doesn't fit with you. That's okay. Move on and try something else. He's not saying that all of these have to work all of the time for everybody. So having a lot of variety in that, I think, allows people to find really what works for them.
Totally. He emphasizes this throughout the book too, trust your own experience. If this does not fit with your experience, and if it's not useful to you, throw it out, right? Don't use it. And that's a really important call too, for everything. If it's not useful, if it's not helpful for you, you don't have to adopt it.
Right. Exactly. So then the next topic he kind of takes on in this book as he moves from diffusion is the difference between emotions and behaviors. And kind of what did you think about his take on the difference there?
I think it is so important. This is one of my favorite parts about this, because we often have very little control over our emotions. we have a lot of control over our behaviors. So when I think about this, I use the example of stubbing your toe, right? So let's say you stub your toe, and like nothing makes me angrier than stubbing my toe, right? Like that just is like, makes me so mad right away. Okay. And so if you attach onto that emotion and are mad, like I could storm around the house all day. I could be like, oh, well, this is going to be a horrible day. And then guess what? It is, because I thought it would be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, our emotions have the ability to affect our behaviors, right? Or I could stub my toe. It could make me angry, right? And I could acknowledge that anger, let it exist, and decide to act in accordance with my values, right? To call a friend, to eat breakfast. It always happens that I stub my toe in the morning, right? Like it's always in the morning, right? So, like go eat breakfast or something like that, that actually does give meaning to my life. Because if I just sit in the emotion of anger all day, well, then I've spent the entire day harumphing around, right? And not acting in accordance with values. But, the emotion isn't bad. It can be there. It is allowed, right? It's not good or bad. It just is. But the behaviors can be helpful or unhelpful.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I don't know. Do you have an emotion that comes up for you when you think of like an emotion that typically impacts behavior for you?
Yeah, I think I get road rage sometimes, just being completely
Yes.
honest. I think we've all experienced it, especially in traffic.
Yes.
And I notice if it's like driving home at the end of the day, if I've had more of a stressful day, I'm more likely to act on my road rage, to kind of, weave in and out and do the things you're not supposed to do. I'm not advocating for any of these things. But if I've had more of a kind of not stressful day, or if I've been able to kind of cope with what came up through the day a little bit better, and I'm in a more mindful mindset, things don't make me as mad when I'm driving.
Mm-hmm.
And that person cut me off, oh, that's okay, I'm just kind of sit back listening to the music. And so I think, when you asked me that, that's the first thing that came to my mind, is as a time when my emotions can get really high, but I also notice that when they're not, or when I'm more mindful, I feel like I have more control. And I think that goes really well with this quote that Dr. Harris has in the book. He says, if we consciously bring our awareness to how we are feeling and consciously observe how we're behaving, then no matter how intense our emotions are, we can still control our actions. So in this, he's bringing back the idea of this observing self, right? Because the observing self doesn't have any emotion or thought attached to it. It's just that focus and that awareness and that attention. And so if we can kind of shift that to look at what's happening, then we are still in control of our actions, and we're not being controlled by our emotions.
Right. I think that is so crucial. And I think it's actually really empowering, right? That we don't have to follow the natural conclusion of our emotions, that they are allowed to be there, and that they're fine. And sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're not helpful, and we can feel them and notice them and all of that stuff. But that, that doesn't get in the way from us taking valued action.
Mm-hmm.
Or even like, I think about this in terms of like working out, right? Like sometimes I'm just like, you know what? I do not feel like doing this right now. I feel lazy, and I feel, apathetic and whatever. But one of my values is taking care of my physical body, right? Like yoga is my favorite, hands down my favorite workout, right? And so it's like, okay, I'm going to do it anyways. And typically I enjoy myself, right? My body feels good afterwards, right? But like, it's, just because I feel like I don't want to do it and do it anyways, like it's still taking valued action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's so important. Kind of thinking about, as mental health professionals, a lot of times people come to us wanting to get rid of their emotions, but that's because their emotions are in their mind causing them to either do or not do things that they do or don't value, right? Someone might come to you with depression and they're saying, I don't have any motivation to get out of bed. I just kind of want to sleep. And when you look at kind of why that matters to them, because maybe their education matters to them and they want to go to class, but they just don't feel like they have the energy to do so. And so we really are a lot of times in the mental health world looking at how we have control or don't have control over our actions, not our emotions.
Right. And I think that's why ACT is such a sustainable model, because typically, right, you can go through counseling, and obviously I think counseling is the best, right? But you can go through counseling, and when you're done, guess what? You might still have anxiety, right? And probably you're going to have it still, right? Even though you've done counseling. Counseling doesn't, it's not a way to fix those kinds of things, right? It's tools for relating to it better.
Right.
And relating to depression better, relating to anxiety better. And I think that's why it's such a sustainable model, because it gives you those skills so that when you're done with counseling, you can practice and you can always come back, right? Counseling is always available, but I think it gives you a model to be successful and self-sufficient.
Yeah, definitely. That goes really well into kind of the next chapter he talks about, which is the struggle switch. This idea that the more that we struggle with our emotions, the more they actually start impacting us, the heavier they become, and the louder they are for us. He talks about this distinction between what he calls clean discomfort and dirty discomfort. And I really loved this when I was reading it. Clean discomfort is the discomfort that just naturally comes up as a response to what we're experiencing, as a response to our emotions. So if I'm angry because I stubbed my toe, that anger, that's clean discomfort. That is a natural reaction to stubbing your toe. You're probably going to be a little bit angry. But the more that we struggle with it, the more that this discomfort level really rises and becomes this dirty discomfort then, because now all of a sudden that anger is impacting the rest of my day. And I'm going to cancel coffee with my friend because I just feel so angry that I can't even talk to anybody right now. When really, like, I was looking forward to that coffee with my friend because it's a value to me to be able to maintain strong friendships. And that's then how this dirty discomfort kind of evolves from that.
Yeah, I think the difference between clean and dirty discomfort is really important, because I think it would be easy to get the wrong idea that like some emotions aren't valid or
Mhm.
aren't appropriate reactions to a stimulus, right? And
Yeah,
that's not true, right? They totally are, right? But it's, when we latch onto them and then start modifying our behavior with emotions that aren't productive,
right,
right? Aren't helpful.
right.
And creating the life we want to live. And that's really the lens by which we filter all of this stuff, right? Is this helpful? Does this help me create a meaningful life? And if it
Exactly.
does, wonderful. If not, diffuse it.
Yep. Yeah. And really we're looking at the time and energy too that we're
Mhm.
spending on this. So if our struggle switch is on, as he would say, we're struggling with the emotions, we're wasting a lot of time and a lot of energy struggling with it. And that is time and energy then we could be putting into what you were talking about, these things that matter to us. We could be putting into our values. And so he says when we turn that struggle switch off, when it's in the off position, our emotions are free. We're not caging them anymore. They can move as they want to move. They might move fast, they might move slow, they might increase in intensity and then they'll decrease in intensity. Some of them will stay around for longer, and some of them are going to disappear pretty quickly. But what we're not doing, we're not wasting that time and energy fighting or avoiding them anymore. We're
Mhm.
acknowledging them. Our observing self is saying they're there, but we can acknowledge that and then still do the things that matter to us.
Yeah. I think that leads us really nicely into talking about expansion. And when we finally arrived at expansion in this book, I was like, okay, this is helpful, because I was, I was like, yeah, I buy into the idea of the observing self and all of this stuff, right? But how do I do it? Right? How do I actually do it? So, what would be your explanation of expansion?
So I'll give kind of my take on expansion because I think for me this feels like something that can be personalized for person to person. Um, because it really depends on how you think about things. But for me, expansion is this idea of opening up and creating space within my body and within my mind for any emotion or any experience that comes up. And for me, it evokes images then of kind of opening up, kind of like opening up your shoulders, stretching out your back, just creating more space in your body. So they can be, so they're not kind of contained in this small space where then a lot of pressure is building. And if the cap comes off, they're going to spill out everywhere in a way we don't want them to spill out. But we're just allowing them to be. And not only that, it's that next step of creating space for them, right? So acknowledging that they're there and saying, okay, you're here, so let me create a little more space for you so you have space to be.
Yeah, I think foundational to the idea of expansion is you have to buy into the idea that there's plenty of space in you for everything that could come up, right? And that it's actually okay for uncomfortable emotions to take up space. And that's a hard one to buy into, right? You're like, no, I don't want that one to be there, right? I want to control it and get rid of it, right? But you actually have to buy into the idea that you have room for it. Just like Kathy, when you were explaining this to me, you talked about how the sky has room for a lot of different types of weather, right? Like here, it's cloudy and overcast and windy, but in California, it's sunny. And the sky has room for both of those things, and also for the rain that is maybe happening elsewhere. And, you know, whatever other weather events, the sky has room for all of it. And that was really helpful.
Yeah, and not only does the sky have room for all of it, but once that weather kind of dissipates and we can see the sky is unchanged. It's still the same sky that's there all the time. And these weather patterns don't leave this everlasting mark on the sky. They just kind of come and go as they're going to.
Yeah, like a chunk of the sky is not missing
because
it was storming, right? Like it's fine. You're gonna be fine.
Yep.
Yeah, that feels really safe to me.
Yeah, to me it gives me a sense of comfort. It kind of, for me, it takes off the pressure that I feel like I need to fight or control everything that's going on. And you can just kind of lay back and allow things to happen, like being on a beach and having waves wash over you, right? Can't control the ocean. It's going to happen. And so you can just kind of be there for the ride.
Right. Well, and I think that's so relevant for right now because we obviously can't control the global pandemic, right? Like you and I at this, you know, at whatever time it is, 2:45 on a Monday, right? We aren't, we can't control that. And so that has been a really stark reminder that I can allow room for my emotions and space for them and let that just be what it is. Because I can't change that thing, but I can still take meaningful action in my life, right? I can still, even though I have this uncomfortable feeling here, I can still call a friend, right? I can still do this podcast with you. I can still call my clients. I can still have my morning coffee. I can still do all of those things that give my life meaning.
Right. And I think too, in this kind of opening up and creating space for emotions, we recognize that the same event can cause vastly different emotions in us too. And that's okay to feel these two different emotions about the same event at the same time. So this pandemic is really scary because it's uncertain as to when things are going to kind of get back to what our normal is. And there's a lot of really awful things happening with this disease going around to people. And so you can be scared of it at the same time. And I can also recognize that I kind of like working from home a little bit and get some comfort in being able to kind of sit on my couch and do a podcast with you. And neither of those emotions negates the other, right? And they can both exist in me at the same time. And they don't have to struggle for kind of which one's the better one or which one's going to come out on top.
Right. And I think that that's just such a good indication that like oftentimes events less catastrophic than a global pandemic produce more than one feeling in us,
Mhm.
right? Like, that's what bittersweet is, right?
Yeah.
Bitter, we have a
Yes.
whole word for it. We have a whole word for it, bittersweet, right? And that, like, we actually have room in us to feel more than one thing, right? And you don't have to say, this is the thing that it is, right?
Mhm.
It's this. It actually can be a lot of different things, and that encourages us to live life in the gray,
Mhm.
which is where I think we do the most meaning making in life, is in that gray space, not in the black or the white.
Yeah, definitely. And I think 95% of our life happens in that gray space too.
Oh yeah, 100%, right? What,
Yeah.
like it or not, that's where it is.
Yep. Yep. And so he kind of briefly talks about 4 steps of expansion. And I wanted to highlight these steps because they can be a little abstract, but the point is to kind of make this what you want it to be or what you need it to be. What did you think, kind of going through each of the steps of these steps?
So there were a few, right? So the first one is observe. And I was like, I can do that, right? Breathe into them. Okay, that got a little bit more abstract, but I was like, I'll just keep breathing then. Okay, right? So
Yeah.
noticing them, doing that. Okay, make room for them. And I think maybe I misspoke when I said I don't like think in images, because
Mhm.
I think I couldn't think of another way to think of it than the sky, right?
Mhm.
So I would like place the emotion in the sky, right? And imagine all the other space there was,
Mhm.
right? So just lived there, and just allow it to be. And I think, you know what? I'm gonna just be honest. I don't think I'm good at this yet,
Mm.
right? And that's okay, right?
Yeah.
I noticed that that's the story I'm telling myself is that I'm not good at it yet, right? But it is kind of abstract, and I was like, maybe you're not getting it yet. I don't know. What do you think about it when you practice expansion?
Yeah, so it is abstract. And it kind of, I have similar thoughts as to what you shared with kind of what does that mean, right? When step 2 is breathe into and around the sensation. And these are really steps and tasks of kind of creating what this image looks like for yourself. Um,
Mhm.
and I think it's important to let people know you can do this however you want to do it, however it makes sense to you. You don't ever have to tell anybody how it makes sense to you if you're embarrassed by it. It just has to make sense to you, right? And
Mhm.
so it could be maybe important for someone who is more of a kinesthetic learner to have like a rock or a marble that they hold in their hand, and you think of breathing into and out of that marble as whatever sensation or emotion that you're experiencing, to kind of physicalize it a little bit, or just having some sort of image in your mind like the sky of what that means, and the same thing for the creating space and the allowing it to be there. It's whatever people, however people make sense of that, essentially. And it's also important to recognize that Leah, you said that you don't feel like you're very good at this right now. I I don't feel like I'm very good at it either, but that's not the goal. The goal isn't to be good at it.
Mhm.
The goal is to recognize when we need to do it and practice it.
Yes.
That's why it's a practice. I don't think you're ever gonna get to the point where you're perfect at it. If you do, good for you. That's really great. I probably want to talk to you. Um, but it's just the intentionality around recognizing, when we might need this.
Yeah, I love when Dr. Harris says, as we practice this, one of two things will happen. Either your feelings will change or they won't.
Mhm.
And it doesn't matter either way, because it's not about changing your feelings, it's about accepting that they are there, right?
Yep.
So the impact of the emotion changes, not the feeling itself, right?
Yep.
So sadness might still be hanging around. The idea is that we get better at letting it be.
Exactly. And to kind of follow up with another quote that he has in this book, he says, in ACT, accepting discomfort has only one purpose: to help you take your life forward in a meaningful direction.
Mm.
That's the only purpose of this. It's not to get rid of these uncomfortable emotions. It's not to learn how to better control your thoughts. the goal here is to learn how to live a meaningful life in the direction that you want to go. And I think that's so powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. I love that it does have a purpose, right? You know, if I'm like, if I have to feel uncomfortable, it's good, there's going to be a reason for it, right?
Yeah.
And it's to create meaning and to create a life worth living.
Yeah. So any last minute thoughts on anything that we talked about, Leah, today?
No, I already confessed that the observing self was with me through the bangs era, the bowl cut time. I think I've said enough for today.
Yeah.
What about you, Cassie? Anything else you want to say?
Everyone knows about my road rage now, but no, I think, whoever's still with us and listening to this, I hope that they're being able to kind of expand their mind into bringing in some of these concepts, because they're not concepts that are talked about readily in our daily lives. A lot of us don't grow up learning some of this. And so I'm excited that we're doing this, because I think they're really important principles that we're talking about. And I hope that people are kind of getting some benefit out of it with us.
I hope so too.
Yeah. So next week, for those of you following along with us, we will be reviewing chapters 15 through 23 of the Happiness Trap. It'll be our third out of 4 scheduled podcasts for this month.
Oh my goodness. Halfway there, team.
We're halfway there. We are. So thank you again for listening, and we will see you all next week.
See you then.
Bye.